The ballroom of the Langford Hotel glittered like something out of a movie. Crystal chandeliers hung above hundreds of well-dressed guests, reflecting soft gold light across polished marble floors. A jazz band played near the stage, and the air smelled faintly of expensive wine and pine from the enormous Christmas tree near the entrance. It was the annual holiday party for Caldwell Pierce and Grant, one of the most powerful law firms in Chicago. 200 lawyers, corporate executives, and partners filled the room. Conversations overlapped in low, confident voices. Deals were being discussed beside the champagne bar. Junior associates hovered near senior partners, hoping to be noticed. At the center of it all stood my sister. Victoria Bennett had always looked comfortable in rooms like this. She stood on stage in a deep red dress, holding a champagne glass while applause rolled across the ballroom. Moments earlier, the managing partner had just announced that she would become the youngest equity partner in the firm's history. People were congratulating her like she had just won an award. Victoria smiled, clearly enjoying the attention. She glanced across the crowd and then said something into the microphone that made my stomach tighten. "And tonight," she said, laughing softly, "I even convinced my sister to come celebrate with us." Before I could react, she pointed directly at me. "Chloe, come up here for a second." 200 faces turned toward me. I hadn't planned on being part of the evening's entertainment, but refusing would only make things worse. I walked toward the stage slowly, the heels of my shoes clicking against the marble floor. Victoria wrapped an arm around my shoulders once I reached her. "Everyone," she said brightly into the microphone, "this is my little sister Chloe." She paused for effect. The family's failure. The laughter came instantly. It wasn't cruel laughter exactly. It was the kind people make when they assume something must be a harmless joke. Several associates near the back chuckled. Someone raised their glass. I even noticed a young lawyer lifting his phone slightly, probably recording the moment. Victoria continued smiling like it was all part of the celebration. "While I've been working 80-hour weeks becoming partner here," she said, "Chloe has been experimenting with tech projects." More laughter rippled through the room. "She dropped out of law school after one semester," Victoria added with a shrug. "So now she plays with computers." The crowd laughed again. I said nothing. I simply smiled. Across the ballroom, one person wasn't laughing. Jonathan Pierce, the managing partner of Caldwell Pierce and Grant, stood near the bar watching the stage with a strange expression on his face. While everyone else enjoyed the joke, he looked at me carefully, as if trying to remember where he had seen me before. Then he started walking toward us. Victoria kept talking into the microphone, clearly enjoying the attention. "Our parents always say every family needs variety," she joked. "One child becomes a partner at a major law firm. The other one explores alternative career paths." More polite laughter. The band behind us played a soft chord as the room buzzed with conversation again. But Pierce continued walking through the crowd, his eyes fixed on me. I noticed him before Victoria did. For a brief moment our eyes met, and that was when her smile began to freeze. Because 3 years earlier, the law firm celebrating her promotion had been hours away from collapse, and the silent investor who had saved it was standing right beside her. The ballroom still looked exactly the same as it had when the night began. The towering Christmas tree glowed beside the stage. Waiters carried trays of champagne through the crowd. Lawyers laughed with clients near the bar, as if the evening were nothing more than a celebration of success. But something subtle had changed. The attention in the room had shifted. Jonathan Pierce stepped onto the stage beside us. The room quieted almost instantly. When the managing partner of a firm like this interrupted a speech, people paid attention. Victoria laughed nervously and lowered the microphone. "Jonathan," she said lightly, "I hope I didn't steal your spotlight." He didn't smile. Instead, he looked directly at me. "Miss Bennett," he said calmly. "Chloe Bennett. Correct?" I nodded. "Yes." Victoria glanced between us, clearly confused. "Yes, that's my sister," she said quickly. "Why?" Pierce didn't answer her. "When did you arrive in Chicago?" he asked me. "This afternoon," I said. He nodded slowly. For several seconds, he studied my face as if confirming something in his mind. Then he said the one sentence that made the entire moment feel different. "We've been trying to reach you for months." Victoria blinked. "Reach her," she said, laughing awkwardly. Why would the firm be trying to reach Chloe? Pierce finally looked at her. "This concerns Ironcrest Capital," he said. The name meant nothing to most of the people in the room. But several senior partners standing near the stage suddenly looked alert. Victoria frowned. "Ironcrest, what?" Pierce turned back to me. "Miss Bennett," he said quietly. "Would you be willing to join us upstairs for a brief meeting?" The room had grown noticeably quieter now. People nearby were whispering to each other. Victoria stared at me. "What is he talking about?" she asked under her breath. I didn't answer right away. Instead, I looked out across the ballroom. 200 people had watched my sister introduce me as the family failure. Most of them were still waiting for the punchline. But there was no punchline coming. Because the truth was something none of them had imagined. I finally turned back to Pierce. "Yes," I said. "I think that would be a good idea." The next morning I woke up to the pale gray light of a Chicago winter pressing through the tall windows of my hotel room. For a moment I just lay there, staring at the ceiling, replaying the night before. The laughter, Victoria's voice echoing through the ballroom. "This is my sister Chloe, the family's failure." I had heard variations of that sentence my entire life. Somehow hearing it again in front of 200 lawyers didn't even surprise me anymore. What surprised me was everything that came after. My phone buzzed on the nightstand. I reached for it and immediately saw the notifications. Missed calls, text messages, emails. The screen was full of them. Most were from numbers I didn't recognize. Probably people from the law firm who had suddenly become very interested in speaking to me. A few were from Chicago area codes that I guessed belonged to journalists or corporate contacts who had heard rumors about the meeting upstairs. But the messages that caught my attention were the ones from my family. 3 texts from my mother, 1 short message from my father, and 6 missed calls from Victoria. I set the phone back down without answering any of them. Public humiliation was nothing new in the Bennett family. The only difference this time was that the story they believed about me was finally starting to crack. Outside my window, Lake Michigan looked like a sheet of dull steel under the winter sky. Cars crawled through the streets far below while the city slowly woke up. For most of the people who had attended the Christmas party, last night had probably ended like any other corporate celebration. Drinks, networking, a few awkward speeches. But for me, that ballroom had reopened a history that went back much further than one holiday party. The Bennett family had always been very clear about what success looked like. We lived in a large colonial house in Connecticut where achievement wasn't just encouraged. It was expected. My father, Thomas Bennett, had spent 30 years teaching constitutional law at Yale. His former students had gone on to become federal judges, prosecutors, and senators. My mother, Eleanor Bennett, had served as a state court judge for most of my childhood. She believed in discipline, preparation, and the idea that a person's reputation was the most valuable thing they possessed. Dinner conversations in our house were rarely about ordinary things. Instead, we talked about Supreme Court decisions, high-profile trials, and which law schools were producing the best graduates that year. In that environment, my older sister thrived. Victoria Bennett was everything my parents believed a successful daughter should be. She was confident, articulate, and relentlessly competitive. In high school, she won debate tournaments and academic awards. At Harvard Law, she graduated near the top of her class and immediately landed a position at Caldwell Pierce & Grant. My parents spoke about her career the way some families talk about championship sports teams. She's going to argue cases that shape national policy one day. My father liked to say, "She carries the Bennett name with pride." My mother would add, "Victoria never disagreed with them." From the time she was a teenager, she carried herself like someone who already knew exactly how her future would unfold. Then there was me. While Victoria studied case law and court rulings, I spent most of my childhood taking apart computers in the basement. I loved understanding how systems worked, Not just computers, but the hidden structures behind them: networks, security protocols, financial software, the parts most people never thought about. My parents didn't see it that way. To them, it looked like a distraction. When I told them I was interested in technology instead of law, they reacted the way people react when a child says they want to become a magician or a professional skateboarder. It sounded like a hobby, not a career. Eventually, I did what they expected and enrolled in law school. For exactly one semester. I remember sitting in a lecture hall listening to a professor explain contract law while my mind wandered somewhere else entirely. Every case study felt like a puzzle someone else had already solved. By the end of that semester, I knew I couldn't keep pretending. When I told my parents I was leaving law school, the silence at the dinner table felt heavier than any argument. My father put his fork down and looked at me like he was trying to understand how something had gone wrong. "You're throwing away opportunities people spend their whole lives trying to earn," he said. My mother didn't say anything at all. Victoria was the one who finally broke the silence. "Well," she said lightly, "I guess every family needs a cautionary tale." From that day forward, the story about me became simple. Victoria was the successful daughter. I was the one who had lost her way. At family gatherings, people would ask about Victoria's latest case or promotion. Then someone would turn to me with polite curiosity. "And what are you working on these days?" "Chloe." Victoria usually answered before I could. "She's still figuring things out," she would say with a smile. After a while, I stopped correcting anyone. It was easier to let them believe the version of me they had already decided on. Because by that point, I had learned something important. Sometimes the best way to build something powerful is to let everyone assume you're insignificant. And the strange thing was this. 3 years before that Christmas party in Chicago, when my sister's law firm had been quietly struggling to survive, the person who ended up saving it was someone she never would have considered important enough to notice. I left Connecticut 2 weeks after I dropped out of law school. There was no dramatic goodbye, no family meeting, no attempt to convince anyone to understand my decision. I packed everything that mattered into the back of my car and started driving west before sunrise. My father stood in the driveway with his arms folded. "Don't expect the Bennett name to open doors for you anymore," he said. My mother didn't come outside. Victoria watched from the front porch while scrolling through something on her phone. "Good luck with your computer experiments," she said without looking up. That was the last real conversation we had for a long time. I drove for 3 days before reaching Seattle. Back then, I could barely afford the tiny studio apartment I rented in an old brick building near downtown. The place had creaky floors, thin walls, and a window that looked out at a parking garage. But it had one thing that mattered: silence. No expectations. No family reputation hanging over my decisions. For the first time in my life, the direction of my future belonged entirely to me. Most days I spent hours in front of my laptop writing code. I wasn't working for anyone yet. I was just exploring problems that fascinated me: security systems, payment platforms, financial software. The deeper I went into those systems, the more I realized something most people never thought about. Digital financial systems were full of invisible weaknesses. Banks trusted software. Companies trusted automated payment networks. And the people building those systems were often moving so fast that they missed critical vulnerabilities. One night, while testing a financial payment platform used by a regional bank, I discovered something serious: a flaw in their transaction verification process. With the right exploit, someone could redirect transfers and move money between accounts without triggering the system's alerts. Millions of dollars could disappear before anyone noticed. For a few seconds, I just stared at the code on my screen. I could have done it. I could have exploited the weakness and taken the money without anyone tracing it back to me. Instead, I reported it. The company had a bug bounty program for exactly that situation. Security researchers could submit vulnerabilities in exchange for a reward. 2 weeks later, I received an email asking if I was available for a phone call. The reward they offered was larger than anything I had earned in my life. The money changed my situation overnight. But the reward itself wasn't the most important part. The important part was what the discovery showed me. I had a skill that most people didn't. I could see weaknesses inside complex systems that others overlooked. Once I understood that, the rest of my life started moving very quickly. I used the reward money to launch a small cybersecurity startup. At the beginning, it was barely more than an idea and 3 laptops inside a shared workspace. 2 software engineers joined me within the first few months. Neither of them cared that I had dropped out of law school or that my family thought I was wasting my life. They cared that the technology worked. Our product focused on something very specific: fraud detection. Financial companies process millions of transactions every day, and identifying suspicious activity before it becomes a real loss is incredibly difficult. We built software that could analyze transaction patterns and detect unusual behavior faster than traditional banking systems. At first, we worked with small fintech startups. Then larger companies started noticing. Within 2 years, our software was protecting payment systems that handled hundreds of millions of dollars in transactions. The company grew faster than I expected. Investors started reaching out. Partnership offers arrived almost every week. Eventually, one of the largest cybersecurity firms in the country offered to acquire the company. I remember sitting in a conference room staring at the acquisition contract while my attorney explained the details. At 25 years old, I suddenly had more money than I had ever imagined earning. Friends insisted we celebrate. They wanted to throw a huge party. Instead, I spent most of that evening alone in my apartment. I kept thinking about my parents, about Victoria. I imagined calling them. I pictured the surprise in their voices when they realized the family failure had built something successful after all. But every time I picked up the phone, I hesitated. Victoria's voice echoed in my memory. So now we officially have a dropout in the family. I set the phone back down. Some stories didn't need to be corrected right away. Instead of announcing my success, I started studying something new: investment structures. During the acquisition process, I had learned how many large professional firms, law firms, consulting groups, accounting companies, relied on outside capital during financial downturns. Banks were often reluctant to lend to those organizations because their revenue could fluctuate dramatically. But those firms still needed funding to survive difficult periods. That gap created a quiet opportunity. Within a year, I launched a private investment firm called Iron Crest Capital. Its strategy was simple: provide emergency capital to professional service firms when they needed it most, but always through silent partnerships. Our investments stabilized companies without drawing attention to who provided the money. The arrangement protected both sides. The firms avoided public embarrassment, and my name stayed out of the spotlight. Ironcrest reviewed dozens of potential opportunities across the country. Most were consulting groups or accounting firms dealing with short-term financial pressure. Then, one evening, my analyst sent me a financial report that made me stop reading halfway through. The company facing a liquidity crisis was a Chicago law firm, Caldwell, Pierce & Grant, my sister's law firm. For a long time, I simply stared at the name on the screen. For the first time since leaving Connecticut, the world my family believed in and the life I had built were about to collide. And within a few weeks, that struggling law firm would receive an $8 million investment that would keep its doors open. An investment that came from Ironcrest Capital. An investment no one inside the firm would ever trace back to me, least of all my sister. The financial report arrived in my inbox on a quiet Tuesday evening. I was still in my Seattle office, long after most of the city had gone home. The lights from neighboring buildings reflected against the glass walls, while rain tapped softly against the windows. My analysts had already filtered dozens of companies for Ironcrest Capital that week. Most of them followed the same pattern: temporary cash flow issues, declining clients, management mistakes. But one report stopped me halfway through the first page. Caldwell, Pierce & Grant. I read the name twice before opening the rest of the file. There was no mistake. It was the same law firm where Victoria had built her career. The firm she had spent years praising during family dinners. The one my parents proudly mentioned whenever someone asked what their daughter did for a living. For the first time since leaving Connecticut, the professional world I had built and the family world I had escaped were suddenly connected. I leaned back in my chair and continued reading. The situation inside the firm was worse than I expected. Two of their largest corporate clients had recently left for a competing firm. A few senior partners were preparing to retire, taking major accounts with them. The company's operating reserves had been shrinking for months. On paper, Caldwell Pierce and Grant still looked powerful. But the financial projections told a different story. Without immediate capital, they would soon face serious problems. Layoffs, practice group closures, possibly even dissolution if the situation worsened. The firm had already approached several banks for loans. Every request had been declined. Traditional lenders were cautious about law firms during unstable periods. Their income depended heavily on client retention, which meant their future revenue was difficult to guarantee. Ironcrest specialized in exactly that kind of situation. But this opportunity was different. I closed the report and stared at the rain sliding down the window. If I invested in the firm, I would be helping Victoria. Helping the very career she had used for years as proof that I had failed. Part of me considered rejecting the opportunity immediately. Ironcrest had plenty of other investments to consider. Walking away from this one would be easy. But another part of me kept looking at the numbers. Despite the recent losses, the firm still had strong litigation teams and respected partners. Their long-term outlook wasn't hopeless. They simply needed breathing room. $8 million would stabilize the firm almost overnight. The investment would also generate significant returns once the firm recovered. I opened the report again. That was when I noticed something unusual. Buried inside the firm's financial statements were a series of transactions that didn't quite make sense. Several large payments had been categorized as consulting expenses. The amounts were substantial, but the documentation explaining them was minimal. I forwarded the section to one of my analysts. Take a closer look at these, I wrote. 2 days later, he returned with a more detailed breakdown. The payments were routed through multiple internal accounts before leaving the firm entirely. Nothing about them was technically illegal. But the pattern raised questions. Whoever approved those transfers held significant authority inside the firm, and they weren't providing clear explanations for where the money was going. That didn't stop the investment process, but it made me cautious. Before Ironcrest finalized any deal, we always conducted a deeper investigation. Within a week, our analysts confirmed the firm's immediate problem was still liquidity. If Caldwell Pierce and Grant received capital quickly enough, the firm would recover. Without it, their situation would deteriorate rapidly. I scheduled a call with the firm's managing partner. Jonathan Pierce answered on the second ring. His voice sounded calm but tired. After reviewing the numbers together, he admitted the firm needed help. We've been exploring several options, he said, but none of them move fast enough. Ironcrest moved fast. Within 48 hours, we drafted the investment structure. $8 million in emergency capital. In exchange, Ironcrest would receive a quiet partnership position tied to the firm's long-term revenue. But I added one condition. My identity would remain confidential. The investment agreement listed Ironcrest Capital as the partner providing funds. My name would not appear in any documents distributed within the firm. Only 2 people would know the truth. Jonathan Pierce and the firm's external financial counsel. Pierce agreed without hesitation. For firms in financial distress, anonymity often helped preserve stability. If clients believed a company was being rescued by outside investors, they sometimes panicked and moved their business elsewhere. A silent investment avoided that risk. The contract also included several protective clauses. Ironcrest would receive regular financial reports. Our firm would have the right to request independent audits. And if suspicious transactions continued, we could demand an immediate review of the firm's finances. 3 days later, the money was transferred. $8 million moved quietly from Ironcrest Capital into the firm's operating accounts. The impact was immediate. Outstanding obligations were covered. Internal panic faded. Within weeks, the firm regained its footing. From the outside, Caldwell Pierce and Grant appeared to recover naturally. New clients arrived. Old ones stayed. Victoria's career continued rising inside the company. At family dinners, she talked proudly about how the firm had weathered a difficult year. She never once mentioned outside investment. And she certainly never imagined the rescue had come from me. For 3 years, the secret stayed buried. Ironcrest continued monitoring the firm's financial reports as part of our partnership agreement. Most of the numbers improved steadily. But those unusual transactions I had noticed earlier never completely disappeared. Every few months, another questionable payment would appear in the reports. Small enough to avoid attention, large enough to raise suspicion. By the time Victoria invited me to the firm's Christmas party in Chicago, I had already arranged a private meeting with Jonathan Pierce. Officially, I was attending the party as her sister. Unofficially, I was there for something else entirely. Because the silent investor who saved her firm was about to find out who inside the company had been quietly stealing from it. The music in the ballroom continued for a few seconds after Jonathan Pierce stepped onto the stage. Then the band slowly faded out as people began to notice something unusual was happening. Victoria still held the microphone in her hand, smiling awkwardly as if she expected the moment to pass quickly. "Jonathan," she said lightly, "I promise I'm almost finished." But Pierce didn't laugh. He stepped closer to the center of the stage and looked directly at me. "Miss Bennett," he said calmly. "Chloe Bennett." "Correct." The room quieted almost instantly. I nodded. "Yes." Victoria looked confused. "Yes? That's my sister," she said quickly, giving a small laugh. "Why?" Pierce ignored the question. "When did you arrive in Chicago?" he asked me. "This afternoon." He nodded slowly, as if confirming something. The silence in the room grew heavier. Victoria shifted uncomfortably beside me. "Is this about Chloe applying for a job here?" she joked into the microphone. A few associates laughed politely, but Pierce didn't react. Instead, he said something that made several senior partners near the stage look up immediately. "We've been trying to reach Miss Bennett for several months." The laughter stopped. Victoria blinked. "Reach her," she repeated. "Why would the firm need to reach Chloe?" Pierce finally turned toward her. "This concerns Ironcrest Capital." The name floated through the ballroom like a puzzle no one had expected to hear tonight. Most people in the room didn't react, but several partners near the front exchanged quick glances. Victoria frowned. "Ironcrest, what?" she asked. Pierce looked back at me. "Miss Bennett," he said quietly. "Would you be willing to join us upstairs for a brief meeting?" I could feel the attention of the entire room settling over the stage. Victoria lowered the microphone. "What is he talking about?" she whispered to me. I didn't answer. Instead, I looked out across the ballroom. 200 people were watching us. Many of them had been laughing only moments earlier. Now they were whispering. Pierce raised his hand slightly toward the band. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said calmly, "I apologize for the interruption. We need to hold a short meeting with several partners. The celebration will continue shortly." The band nodded and began playing softly again, though the music now felt strangely out of place. Victoria grabbed my arm before I stepped away from the microphone. "Chloe," she said quietly but sharply, "what is going on?" I met her eyes. "You'll find out soon." Her expression tightened. We stepped down from the stage. The crowd parted slightly as Pierce led the way through the ballroom. Conversations began to ripple through the room behind us. "Who is she?" "Ironcrest Capital. Isn't that the firm that invested in us?" "Wait. That's Victoria's sister." The whispers followed us all the way to the elevators. Victoria walked beside me now, her earlier confidence completely gone. "What did you do?" she asked. "Nothing," I said. "That's the problem." The elevator doors opened with a soft chime. Pierce stepped inside first. I followed. Victoria hesitated for half a second before stepping in after us. The doors slid closed, cutting off the sound of the party. For the first time that evening, the room was completely quiet. Pierce pressed the button for the executive floor. The elevator began moving upward. Victoria folded her arms. "This better not be some kind of misunderstanding," she said. Pierce didn't respond. Instead, he looked at me. "Thank you for coming tonight," he said quietly. "I'm glad we're finally able to speak in person." Victoria's head snapped toward him. "Finally," she said. What does that mean? Pierce kept his attention on me. I assume you received our emails regarding the financial review. Yes, I said. Victoria stared at both of us. What financial review? The elevator stopped. The doors opened onto a quiet hallway lined with private conference rooms. The noise of the party downstairs felt like it belonged to another building entirely. Pierce stepped out and gestured toward a large glass door at the end of the hall. Right this way. Victoria followed us, her heels clicking sharply against the polished floor. Inside the conference room, several people were already waiting. The firm's chief financial officer sat at the far end of the table with a stack of documents. Two senior partners stood beside the window speaking quietly with an external auditor. When we entered, all of them looked up. Victoria stopped walking. What is this? She demanded. Pierce closed the door behind us. A meeting that should have happened weeks ago, he said. He walked to the head of the table and opened a thick folder. Inside were several financial reports. The CFO slid another document across the table toward him. Victoria looked from one person to another. Someone want to explain why my sister is here? She asked. Pierce didn't answer immediately. Instead, he turned the folder so that the documents faced me. I'm afraid we've discovered something concerning during our audit, he said. Victoria frowned. What audit? Pierce glanced at her briefly. The one requested by Ironcrest Capital. Victoria shook her head slowly. You keep saying that name like I'm supposed to understand it. Pierce closed the folder. Victoria, he said carefully. Ironcrest Capital is the firm that invested $8 million into Caldwell Pierce and Grant 3 years ago. She nodded impatiently. Yes, I know that. Her eyes moved between Pierce and me. But what does that have to do with Chloe? Pierce finally answered. Because Miss Bennett represents that firm. The room went completely silent. Victoria stared at him. Then she looked at me. That's not funny, she said. Pierce's voice remained calm. I'm not joking. Victoria's smile faded slowly. And for the first time that evening, she realized the joke she told on stage might have been about the wrong person. The conference room felt colder than the ballroom downstairs. The door clicked shut behind us, sealing out the music, the laughter, and the celebration that was still continuing 1 floor below, inside the room. The atmosphere was completely different. Jonathan Pierce walked to the head of the table and set the thick audit folder down in front of him. Victoria was still standing near the door. This is ridiculous, she said. Someone explain why my sister is suddenly involved in the firm's financial meetings. No one laughed. Pierce opened the folder and slowly slid several documents across the table. Please sit down. Victoria, he said calmly. She hesitated for a moment, then pulled out a chair and sat. Her eyes kept moving between me and the papers. What exactly is this about? She asked. Pierce nodded toward the firm's chief financial officer. Daniel. The CFO adjusted his glasses and opened a laptop. Over the past year, he began, our quarterly financial reviews revealed several transactions that didn't match internal spending records. Victoria frowned. What kind of transactions? Consulting payments, he said. Large ones. He turned the laptop so everyone could see the spreadsheet. Several columns of numbers filled the screen. Approximately $2 million in total, he continued. The room stayed quiet. Victoria leaned forward. That has to be a mistake, she said. Our accounting department would have caught that. That's the problem, the CFO replied. These transactions were approved internally. He clicked to the next page. The payments moved through a series of internal accounts before leaving the firm entirely. Each transfer required partner authorization, he explained. Victoria's expression changed. Her confidence from the ballroom was disappearing piece by piece. Are you accusing someone here of stealing from the firm? She asked. Pierce didn't answer immediately. Instead, he turned to me. As you know, he said, Ironcrest Capital's investment agreement allows the firm to request oversight reviews. I nodded. Yes? Victoria looked between us. What does Ironcrest have to do with this? Pierce folded his hands on the table. Ironcrest requested a deeper audit when the irregularities appeared. Victoria turned toward me again. Why would your company be auditing us? Pierce answered before I could. Because Miss Bennett is the founder of Ironcrest Capital. The silence that followed felt heavier than anything in the ballroom earlier. Victoria stared at him. Then she laughed once, sharply. That's not funny. No one responded. Her eyes slowly shifted toward me. You're serious, she said. I didn't speak. Pierce did. 3 years ago, when Caldwell Pierce and Grant faced a liquidity crisis, Ironcrest Capital provided an $8 million capital investment that stabilized the firm. Victoria's chair scraped slightly against the floor as she leaned back. You're saying Chloe saved the firm? Yes, Pierce said simply. For a moment, Victoria didn't move. Her mind was clearly trying to catch up with what she had just heard. I watched her expression change as the realization began to settle in. The sister she had just introduced to 200 people as a failure was the reason the firm still existed. But the meeting wasn't finished. Pierce turned back to the CFO. Continue. Daniel clicked to another document. This is the internal authorization chain for the consulting payments, he said. The screen showed a list of names and approval signatures. Victoria leaned forward again. Her eyes moved down the page. Then they stopped. Her voice dropped to a whisper. That can't be right. She was staring at one name. The partner who had mentored her since the day she joined the firm. The man who had helped guide her career. Her sponsor for the partnership track. Pierce watched her carefully. The evidence is quite clear, he said. Victoria shook her head. He wouldn't do that. The CFO slid another document across the table. These consulting firms receiving the payments, he explained, appear to be shell companies. The paper listed addresses that traced back to empty office spaces. Someone created a financial pipeline, he said. Victoria pressed her hands against the table. No, she repeated quietly. I opened the folder in front of me and removed another set of documents. Ironcrest began tracking those transactions months ago, I said. Everyone looked at me. I placed the reports on the table. Bank transfer records, corporate registrations, communication logs. These shell companies are connected, I continued, to the same partner who approved the payments. Pierce studied the documents. Then he nodded slowly. This gives us enough evidence to act immediately. The tension in the room shifted. For the first time since the meeting began, several partners looked relieved. If the fraud had continued, the firm could have faced lawsuits, regulatory investigations, and public scandal. Stopping it now meant the damage could be contained. Victoria was still staring at the papers. You knew about this, she said quietly to me. We suspected, I said. And you didn't tell me. You never asked. The words hung in the room. For years, she had been certain she understood my life. Certain she knew exactly what kind of person I was. Now she was realizing how little she had actually seen. Pierce stood up from the table. The responsible partner will be suspended pending further investigation, he said. The other partners nodded. The decision was unanimous. Victoria remained silent. Finally, she looked up at me. Her voice was no longer confident. Why didn't you tell anyone who you were? She asked. I closed the folder. Because no one ever cared to know. Downstairs, the Christmas party was still happening. The band was still playing. People were still celebrating Victoria's promotion. But up here, in the quiet conference room above the ballroom, the entire story of the evening had already changed. And in a few minutes, when we returned downstairs, everyone else would finally find out why. The conference room remained silent long after Jonathan Pierce confirmed my identity. No one spoke. No one moved. Even the quiet hum of the city outside the windows felt distant. Victoria sat across from me, her hands resting on the edge of the table as if she needed something solid to hold on to. For most of her life, she had been the person in control of every room she entered. Tonight, that control had slipped away. Pierce finally broke the silence. Miss Bennett, he said, turning slightly toward me. Would you mind explaining Ironcrest's role to the rest of the partners? I nodded. 3 years ago, your firm was facing a serious liquidity crisis, I said. The words sounded almost clinical compared to the emotional storm happening around the table. You had lost 2 major corporate clients and several partners were preparing to retire. Banks refused to extend credit because your revenue projections were unstable. The CFO nodded quietly. Pierce folded his hands. That assessment is accurate. I continued. Ironcrest Capital specializes in emergency capital for professional firms during financial instability. When we reviewed your situation, we believed the firm still had strong long-term potential. Victoria stared at me like she was hearing a stranger speak. So you invested, she said quietly. Yes. How much? $8 million. The number hung in the room. Several partners exchanged glances even though they already knew the figure. Pierce spoke calmly. That investment stabilized our operations immediately. Without it, we likely would have been forced to close multiple practice groups. Victoria slowly leaned back in her chair. So the firm survived because of Chloe. Pierce answered before anyone else could. Yes? The truth settled over the room like a heavy blanket. For years, Victoria had told people she built her career through relentless work and discipline. Now she was realizing the foundation beneath that success had come from someone she had dismissed completely. But the meeting wasn't finished. Pierce turned back toward the audit reports. The financial fraud still needs to be addressed. The CFO pulled another document from the folder. This is the approval chain for the transactions that moved the missing funds. He slid the paper across the table. Victoria already knew the name at the top. Her mentor, the partner who had introduced her to major clients, the man who had personally supported her promotion to equity partner. Her voice came out almost as a whisper. He wouldn't do this. The CFO pointed to the numbers. These transactions were authorized through his office. Every payment required a partner-level signature. Victoria stared at the document. The room felt impossibly quiet again. I reached into my folder and placed another report on the table. Ironcrest has been monitoring these transfers for months, I said. Pierce looked at the document carefully. These bank traces show the funds moving through several shell companies, I explained. Each of those companies leads back to the same source. The CFO studied the information. His expression hardened. This confirms everything. Pierce closed the folder slowly. We'll suspend him immediately pending a full investigation. The other partners nodded. If the scheme had continued much longer, the firm could have faced a public scandal that would destroy its reputation. Catching it now meant the damage could be contained. One of the senior partners finally spoke. Miss Bennett, she said, looking at me. This is the second time Ironcrest has saved this firm. The room absorbed that statement quietly. Once with the $8 million investment. Once by uncovering the fraud. Victoria looked at me again. Her expression had changed completely. The confident smile from the ballroom was gone. What I don't understand, she said softly, is why you never told anyone who you were. I held her gaze. Because no one ever asked. The words landed harder than I expected. Victoria lowered her eyes. For the first time that night, she looked genuinely embarrassed. Pierce stood from the table. There's one more matter, he said. Everyone looked at him. The people downstairs still believe tonight is only about Victoria's promotion. He glanced toward the elevator doors. But this firm owes Miss Bennett a public acknowledgement. Victoria's head lifted quickly. You're going to tell them. Pierce nodded. The silent investor who saved the firm deserves recognition. Victoria looked toward me again. The irony of the situation was impossible to miss. An hour earlier, she had introduced me to 200 people as the family embarrassment. Now those same people were about to learn a very different story. Pierce gathered the documents. Let's return to the ballroom. The partners stood one by one. Chairs slid back across the floor. The meeting was over. But the night wasn't. Victoria remained seated for a moment longer. Then she stood slowly. Chloe, she said quietly. I waited. Why did you come tonight? I thought about the invitation she had sent weeks earlier. About the casual message asking if I wanted to attend the firm's Christmas party. I had business in Chicago, I said. She gave a small, almost humorless laugh. Of course you did. We walked toward the elevator together. Downstairs, the music was still playing. People were still celebrating. They still believed Victoria Bennett was the most powerful person in the room. In a few minutes, that belief was about to disappear. Because when the doors opened and we stepped back into the ballroom, the entire room would finally learn the name of the silent investor they had been thanking for 3 years. The same name they had laughed at earlier that night. Mina? The elevator doors opened and the sound of the party rushed back toward us. Music drifted through the hallway. Glasses clinked. Laughter echoed from the ballroom like nothing unusual had happened that night. For the people downstairs, the evening was still a celebration. Victoria Bennett had just become the youngest equity partner in the history of Caldwell, Pierce and Grant. And somewhere in the crowd, the failure sister she had introduced on stage was probably standing near the bar. That was the story they believed. Jonathan Pierce stepped out of the elevator first. The rest of the partners followed behind him. I walked beside them while Victoria stayed a step back, unusually quiet. As we approached the ballroom doors, Pierce stopped briefly and turned to me. "Are you comfortable with what we're about to do?" he asked quietly. I nodded. "Yes." He gave a small, respectful smile. "Good." The doors opened. The ballroom looked exactly the same as when we had left. The jazz band had picked up the music again. Guests were gathered in small groups talking about cases, deals, and holiday plans. Waiters moved through the room with trays of champagne. Most people didn't even notice us return at first. Then Pierce walked straight toward the stage. One by one, conversations began to quiet. The band slowly faded out again as Pierce stepped up to the microphone. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said calmly, "thank you for your patience." People turned toward the stage. Some were confused. Others simply assumed he had another announcement about Victoria's promotion. Pierce glanced across the crowd. "As many of you know," he continued, 3 years ago this firm faced one of the most difficult financial periods in its history. Several senior associates nodded. They remembered that year. "We lost key clients," Pierce said. "Several partners retired. And for a short time the future of Caldwell, Pierce and Grant was uncertain." The ballroom was quiet now. Most people had never heard those details spoken out loud before. Pierce continued. "At that moment, this firm received an investment that allowed us to stabilize our operations and continue serving our clients." I could see people exchanging curious looks. Many of them had wondered about that mysterious financial recovery. $8 million in capital arrived when we needed it most, Pierce said. He paused. For 3 years, the firm honored the investor's request to remain anonymous. The room held its breath. Pierce looked toward me standing near the stage. "But tonight," he said, "it's time we recognize the person responsible for that decision." He raised a hand toward me. "The founder of Ironcrest Capital and the silent investor who saved this firm." His voice carried clearly across the ballroom. "Is Chloe Bennett." For a moment the room was completely silent. 200 people stared at me. Some looked confused. Others slowly began to understand what they had just heard. I stepped onto the stage. The same stage where Victoria had introduced me earlier. Only now the room felt completely different. Whispers spread through the crowd. "That's Victoria's sister." "Wait, she's the investor." "You're kidding." Near the front of the room, Victoria stood frozen. She didn't look angry. She looked stunned. Pierce handed me the microphone. I hesitated for a second before speaking. "Ironcrest invested in this firm because we believed in its long-term potential," I said. My voice sounded calm, even though I could feel every eye in the room focused on me. "The attorneys here built something strong. Our role was simply to make sure that strength had time to recover." A few partners nodded quietly. The silence in the room had turned into something else now. Respect. Understanding. I glanced briefly toward Victoria. She was still standing near the front of the stage. Then I said something that felt important. "Sometimes," I continued, "the people working quietly behind the scenes are easy to overlook." A few people smiled faintly. "And sometimes," I added, "the people you underestimate are building something you simply haven't seen yet." The applause started slowly. A few claps, then more. Within seconds, the entire ballroom was applauding. It wasn't the loud, celebratory applause Victoria had received earlier. This one felt different, more thoughtful, more genuine. I handed the microphone back to Pierce and stepped down from the stage. The party eventually continued. Conversations shifted. People approached me with questions about Ironcrest Capital, investment strategy, and the firm's future. But the moment I remembered most came later that night. Victoria found me near the entrance as guests began leaving. For once, she didn't sound confident. "Chloe," she said quietly. I turned. She looked like she was choosing her words carefully. "I owe you an apology." I waited. "For what I said tonight," she added. "And for a lot of things before that." The moment felt strange. My sister had spent most of our lives certain she understood me. Tonight was the first time she admitted she didn't. "Apology accepted," I said. Our relationship didn't magically change after that night. But something shifted. For the first time in our lives. Victoria saw me clearly. Not as the sister who failed to follow the family's expectations, but as someone who had built a different kind of success. A quieter one. Months later, Ironcrest Capital expanded its partnerships across several states. Caldwell Pierce and Grant stabilized and continued growing. And every once in a while, I still thought about that moment in the ballroom. The moment when 200 people laughed at the idea that I was a failure. And how quickly that laughter disappeared when the truth finally came out. Because sometimes success isn't loud. Sometimes it grows quietly, far away from the spotlight, until the day the world finally notices. And if you've ever been underestimated the way I was, if someone has ever looked at your life and decided you weren't doing enough, remember something? The most powerful stories are often the ones no one sees being built. If this story reminded you of a moment in your own life when someone finally realized they had completely misjudged you, I'd love to hear about it. Share your experience in the comments. And if you enjoy stories about family drama, quiet revenge, and unexpected justice like this one, stay with the channel. There are many more stories like this coming soon. And if you'd like to hear them first, consider subscribing so you don't miss the next one. This story is fictionalized for dramatic effect.